So we're delighted to have a conversation with Tom Christopher, somebody near and dear to us here in Connecticut and across the country, I think, as a garden writer. He was schooled at the New York Botanical Garden, and I think he has a fascinating journey as a gardener and a garden writer to tell us. Depending on when you started following garden writers, you might have followed Tom's column in Horticulture Magazine, Martha Stewart Living, House and Garden. He's also written, edited, and compiled a number of books over the years. And I have his first book here, In Search of Lost Roses, about rose rustlers in Texas and California, a delightful read. But he also has done a number of other books where he's edited and compiled recommendations and advice from other sustainable gardening experts. And these are all listed on his website. You can see the full list in there. That includes The New American Landscape, a 2011 collection of writings by leading authorities on sustainable gardening. It was praised by the American Society of Landscape Architects as one of the 10 best books of the year that year. And Garden Revolution, a big tome that he put together with Larry Weiner in 2016. That was hailed by the American Horticultural Society as the best book of the year. And more recently, Tom has become a garden ranter and a podcaster. So welcome to the world of audio recordings, Tom. And you are able to listen to his radio program. Podcast is probably the easiest thing for you because the WESU bandwidth is probably not real strong, 88.1 out of Wesleyan, but you can listen to him, download it at any time from his website and play back on any kind of smart tablet or anything. Tom is also a garden ranter. That's a network of professional garden writers and gardeners who carry on interesting conversations and advice for the rest of us. So Tom, also, you might have heard him speak at garden clubs, horticultural societies, garden shows, or trade shows in past years. And we hope he gets back out on the live circuit once all of those start being held in real time as well. So Tom, we have a bunch of questions that members have sent in for you. We shared those with you a little bit earlier as well, but this is just going to be a fun chat back and forth. Members, if you have questions that you're prompted by things Tom said, go ahead, put them in the chat. We hope to get to them. But let's start it out by, how are your theories? What are your theories on gardening and nature and environment these days? And how did you get there?
Yeah, they've really evolved. You know, when I was at the New York Botanical Garden a long time ago as a student, we really treated gardens as decorative things. And it was also at the tail end of the sort of better living through chemistry era. So things like, the soil was just an anchor for plant roots and a matrix to hold the chemicals that you put on it, fertilizers and so forth. And I had a big wake-up call. I still remember my first job where I was working for Columbia University on an old estate along the Hudson River Palisades, and there was a rose garden. And I did in the rose garden what I'd been taught to do, which is I sprayed once a week with insecticides and fungicides, and then with fungicides within 24 hours of every rainstorm. And within about a year or two, the soil in the garden went from a good loam to just a dead heavy clay. And I was shocked when I dug up. I discovered this when I was planting some new roses, and I realized that what I'd been doing was really, really toxic and really destructive.
So you basically were breaking down the whole ecosystem that was there in the soil.
Exactly. Although I wouldn't have put it that way then, but I had at least an inkling that there had to be a better way of treating the landscape than I was doing. And I think that's the valuable thing about gardening is I think it presents, like it or not, it presents you with these lessons in working with natural systems. And I think it's become a passion with me because I think it's a way of teaching environmentalism that is apolitical. You know, you can be a red state gardener or a blue state gardener, and if you spray your rose garden with toxins all the time, you're going to discover the same thing, and you're going to get the same wake-up call. So I think it's very, very useful for that. And currently, particularly since working with Larry Weiner, I'm very much into studying the local ecology of your site and trying to work with that. It's not only healthier for the environment, you end up doing what I like to, it's not only more sustainable, but it's also easier for you if you're working with nature rather than against it.
Well, now we had an interesting question about that. One of our participants said, wait a minute, I'm probably one of the most sustainable gardeners around. I spend a lot of time in my yard, getting rid of the invasives, growing the native plants, figuring out which ones to grow. And she's certainly a professional in this field. You say it's easier, but is it really easier, or where are people in the continuum of getting to the easier point? And are we going to are they all going to make it with us, Moses? You know, I don't know.
I think it can be, if you've got a heavily disturbed, degraded site, the startup can be really tough. It involves a lot of work. But I think once you've got some basic things in place, then it does become easier. And it's also a question of what you're aiming to do. I mean, that question came from somebody who obviously has very high standards and is very ambitious. I'm probably less so. On my weekend garden up in the Berkshires, for instance, I just turned, over the last couple of years, I turned half the lawn into meadow. And it's not a perfect native meadow, but it's full of black-eyed Susans right now, and full of insects. And a rabbit moved in. There was a big hawk came in after the rabbit. So you can do, and I have much less mowing as a result.
Mm-hmm. How big a space is that?
About 5,000 square feet.
Okay. So how do you get the light bulb to turn on with people, and how do you get a neighborhood to transition?
Yeah, I think it's good to start small, first of all, and not hit them over the head with or hit them in the face with a big change. But I think it's also good to talk about how your landscape practices affect families, pets, and wildlife. And I think that can make a big impression on people who really don't care so much about gardening. But if you tell them, you know, what you're putting down on your lawn is poisoning your dog who plays out on the lawn, or, you know, potentially very bad for your children, I think that hits home. And I think that's one of the best ways to begin big changes. I mean, that's what, you know, one of the most important changes, I think, in terms of landscaping in the last decade or so in Connecticut was the change that daycare centers and grade schools can't use chemical pesticides on their grounds. And that was because of concern for the children's health. And it wasn't, you know, strictly speaking, my guess is that most of the people who supported that, and they had to get a lot of people to support that. It was not environmentalism or worries about the wildlife that did that. They were worried about their kids' health.
You've been doing a lot of work with lawns in terms of what else to grow, what different to grow, different kinds of grasses and things. How's that working out? Are people converting over?
Slowly. There's a lot of interest in it. I think we're poised for a change on that. It's, again, you can talk to people, you know, a lot of these lawns that I've been pursuing, particularly like the fine fescues, are, well, you know, you build them as sustainable, but sustainable really means that they use less resources, and that the resources also include your labor. And once you've made the change, you can have a lawn that requires far less fertilization, far fewer sprays, in fact, no sprays, and less mowing, far less mowing. That's what I like about it.
So where can people find good grass seed mixes here for New England, for Connecticut?
You know, Charles Hart Seed Company in Wethersfield, an old company, is really great for mixing up custom grass seed mixes.
Okay, and you've worked with them in the past too, right?
Yeah. I've also, you know, you can also order through the internet, and I've done that. I mean, there's a group in Canada called Wildflower Farm that sells an eco lawn mix that's very good.
And when's going to be the best time for us to start doing lawn work? This has been such a weird, wet summer.
Yeah, it's interesting because people always think in terms of spring for planting grass seed, but actually the best time is at the beginning of September, early fall, late summer, early fall, when the weather starts to cool off, because the grass seed comes up. You have to irrigate then while the grass seed is coming up, but it comes up and it has less competition from weeds. So it gets a head start on filling in the landscape before the weeds do.
Okay, so the pollinator pathway program is encouraging people to plant clover and to mow less often. Do you have some practical advice for us? How much clover do you mix in? How do you integrate that in?
You have to be careful. I had a terrible failure where I put in too much clover and it just took over. So just a little bit of clover, like 5% clover seed mixed in with your grass seed, will give you all the clover you want. But clover is important. The interesting thing about clover was until we came up with chemical herbicides, broadleaf weed killers, clover was considered an essential element of the lawn. Good lawns had to have clover. In fact, if there wasn't clover, people would dismiss it as a poor, impoverished lawn. So this is, going back before World War II, clover was an essential element. White Dutch clover was an essential element in lawns, and I still think it is.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's been pushed out.
Well, the broadleaf weed killers kill all broadleaf plants, including clover. So they had to rebrand clover as a weed, and they made a lot of, they put on a big campaign to turn people against clover, and unfortunately it worked.
But we hopefully are turning that corner. We're going to get back into some more specific plant questions, companion cropping and things. But I wanted to ask you, aside from your own publications and working with someone like Larry Weiner, who are some of the people you follow and have been inspired and shaped by over the years?
Yeah, I was interesting. It's not so much books, it's conversations that seem to make the difference for me. And I would say Douglas Tallamy is a big influence on me. He's not only a brilliant man, but a very generous man. And I find him personally inspiring as well as professionally interesting. And the Wild Ones is a great organization, and the founder, that was actually the way I discovered Wild Ones. Was I ended up years and years ago in like 1990 interviewing Laurel Otto, whose work was the inspiration for the founding of the organization. And she was a great, if you don't know about Laurel, you should read up on her. She was the woman who brought in the first DDT ban locally in the United States and set the stage for the ban of DDT in the United States.
And what state was she in? Where was she?
She was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And she got the state of Wisconsin. She started noticing dead birds in her neighborhood and had been enthusiastic about prairie plants because she grew up on a farm in Wisconsin, and there was a railroad cut through the farm that had preserved a corridor of native prairie plants. And so she'd already gone to battle with her town because she planted prairie plants in her yard, and they came in and mowed it behind her back. And she was a great woman. She brought in the town officials and took them around and showed them what plant had been where, and told them all about each plant, what the medicinal uses were, what the Native Americans used it for, what pollinators used it. She said she practically had them crying by the end of the tour, and made converts. And but she also went to bat against DDT and brought in got in touch with the Environmental Defense Fund in New York, and which was a fledgling organization at that time, and said that she would host any attorneys or consultants that they sent out to Wisconsin until the case was over. And she had her house filled with environmental activists for a while. I don't know what her family felt about that, but they did manage to push through the first state ban on the use of DDT. And from there, it went around the country.
Well, Roger Tory Peterson was instrumental in that too. Paul Spitzer, a fellow who's in his 70s now, grew up here in Old Lyme, was the master's student at Wesleyan University, and he was helping to collect the eggs that were damaged by the DDT. And they went down to Maryland and brought up raptor eggs, eagle and osprey eggs that had not been affected yet because of the heavy use of DDT up here. And they reintroduced the bird populations. He now lives down in Easton, Maryland, comes back here regularly, and is continuing to map and study the recovery of osprey and other raptors. And
Oh, that's great.
yeah. So there's another Wesleyan tie-in there for you. He would be good for your podcast. We'll get to that in just a minute. So another group that you've mentioned about is ELA. Tell us about them a little bit.
Yeah, the Ecological Landscape Alliance. They're a great group. They have I think their motto is because land doesn't come with a user's manual. And they're a collection of everybody from private gardeners to landscape architects and landscapers and nursery people, native nursery people. And they host a lot of educational programs and a lot of meetings where they address different environmental topics. I think they're a very useful group to belong to. They have a great website, which I don't recall the web address off the top of my head, but if you Google Ecological Landscape Alliance, you'll find them. And they have a lot of information on their website, free information too, so you don't have to join.
Okay, where are they hubbed out of? Are they Midwestern or New England, or do they have a predominant?
They're New England, but one of the interesting things about the pandemic was all their education went online, and they started picking up members from all over the country and even from Europe. So they've become more international and much broader in their scope.
Good. We will grab it's ecolandscaping.org. We can pop that up in the chat before we're done with our show. Do you have any favorite gardens or landscapes that you like to go look at now versus maybe when you were doing the estates that were so manicured?
Do you know a garden that was a real pioneer in the ecological landscape? In fact, earlier than a pioneer. I mean, it was a visionary. The man who put it in, Lester Collins, is Inisfree in Millbrook, New York. And was originally inspired by classical Chinese gardens, but Lester Collins, who was the designer who was brought in to help with it, a Harvard-trained landscape designer, realized that the resources for the garden were, in terms of money and labor, were shrinking, and because the owner had used up their funds, they'd spent sort of very, very heavily on the garden and had reached a point where they had to cut back. And he began doing things that really anticipated ecological landscaping, creating habitats. It all centers on this little lake, and he created habitat gardens around the lake, and mixed natives with the introduced plants that he was using. And it's very beautiful. It was the place I went for my first date with my wife, and she corrected all my plant identifications. I was impressed, rather than being outraged. And but we still go back there sometimes.
So Millbrook, New York, Innisfree.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Innisfree just popped it up in the chat. Thank you. So what is Suzanne's background? I thought she was a geologist.
Well, but she teaches. She was interested in botany, or rather biology, before she became a geologist, and she teaches environmental science. So she's got a very sort of broad interest in the environmental science field, and she's been a great help to me in terms of keeping me honest.
So were you a writer first or a gardener first, or when did you realize you were either?
I was a gardener first, a horticulturist, but I was working on that estate for Columbia University, and I was the only gardener on the staff. And it was, frankly, I needed to talk to people about what I was doing. So I started writing articles and gradually developed a bad back and got more and more interested in writing, and transitioned into writing about gardening more than actually doing it.
That might be good advice for a lot of us. I think
Yeah.
we're aging gardeners. Now I've got a series of these are some hands-on horticultural questions. So let's run through a few of these. You had talked about clover and grasses. What are some other number one, does companion planting work? And what are some combos that we should be looking at more?
Yeah, companion planting is a very interesting topic. The popular in the organic gardening press, I one time sat down in the New York Botanical Garden Library, which is a great library, and started tracing back from book to book recommending it. I'd look in the footnotes and see where the book that I was reading had gotten it from. And I eventually traced the classic organic gardening companion planting stuff, you know, like roses like basil and that kind of thing, back to a German self-taught, well, he called himself a scientist, but he was really kind of a crackpot, named Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, who had started taking plants and making extracts of plants, mixing them with copper sulfate, and then letting them crystallize. And if they letting the water evaporate out so they crystallize. And if the crystal patterns were pretty and orderly, he claimed that was proof that the plant had been healthy and happy. And if they were disorganized, he said that was proof that the plant was sick. And then he began mixing extracts of two different plants together. And if they made a good pattern together, he said that clearly meant that they were compatible and should be grown together. And that's the basis of the whole kind of roses like basil stuff, which is utter nonsense. It's just, but there's a guy who I've interviewed a couple of times on my podcast named Robert Couric in California, who's got some books out. And Robert has done a lot of studying about companion planting with respect to plants that attract beneficial insects to the garden. And that, I think, it can be quite valuable. He's got a whole list of plants for every season of the year that the flowers will attract beneficial insects to your garden. And so you can plant them mid your flowers or vegetables and have natural pest control. And
okay, what was his name again, and how long ago was that interview, so we can go pull it up?
Yeah, it's Robert Couric, Kouric. And the interview was quite some time ago. You'll find it if you go to one of the podcast sites like Apple. And it was an early, it must have been over a year ago now.
Okay, so I had not heard that whole thing about companion planting originally, having nothing to do with field trials of what two plants were growing well together.
You know, I was shocked when I found out, and it apparently for whatever reason, he was in tight with J.I. Rodale, the founder of Rodale Press. Mm-hmm. And Rodale Press just accepted what he said as at face value and reprinted it. And gradually the information about how it was derived dropped out of the press. And so now you see it and you have no way of knowing that it's just, I mean, it's craziness.
Yeah. Well, so how about allelopathic impacts of one plant repelling another, like juglans and walnuts, you know?
That can be very valuable. I mean, I've got in my gardens look like the one in Middletown and the one in the Berkshires. It's a real example of the shoemaker's children. They're kind of rudimentary and neglected, except for the vegetable garden. But I got a bed in front of the house that I planted with hay-scented ferns, and they're allelopathic, and they've chased out everything else. And so I now have a very nice bed of ferns. The fine fescues, one of the alternative lawns that I promote, seem to be somewhat allelopathic, and they can flourish for a long time with a minimum of weeds without any weed control.
Interesting. Do you know of other groups that are working on this, like invasive plant control? Because we're trying to do this knotweed thing, and I've heard that pumpkins, cucurbits, have an allelopathic effect on knotweed, but you need enough sun for the pumpkins and no deer to eat the pumpkins. But is there anybody else you've talked with who's leading in work in this area?
No, and it sounds like I should find somebody and have a program on it.
It sounds like you should. What about the concept? Have you seen or done anything with how do garden plants help each other? Susan Simard had, the whole concept about trees helping each other, talking with each other, mother trees.
Yeah, they're
Grooming.
linked by the fungi in the soil.
Mhm.
And I think the mycorrhizal fungi. I think the question asked about vegetable plants, and most of those are annuals. And I suspect that they will form associations with mycorrhizal fungi, but I doubt they're in long enough to really benefit each other much. But if you get into perennials and woody plants, then I would say it's probably very, very much a feature in the garden.
Okay, so now you had already addressed that your yard sounds like slow gardening. You're not worrying about it much. So how do you convince other people to have a not so clean yard and to leave stuff around? Let the leaves lie.
I think if you ask them if they like wildlife, that makes a big difference. I mean, if they want to have birds in their garden, they need caterpillars. And if they want caterpillars, they need a certain amount of leaf litter around the edge of the yard. I clean off where I do have lawns still. I clean most of the leaves off that lawn, although some of them I try to mow up and shred in place. But around the edge of the yard, I leave the leaves in place, and it's good for amphibians, good for pollinators. It's good for a lot of things. And I think if you talk to people about wildlife, that can change their mind.
So you had a really interesting interview a couple of weeks ago on deer ticks and Lyme disease. What are some of the new things you learned about that, and what are your recommendations for gardeners now, or anybody who likes to be outdoors?
Yeah, I should say that two things I came away with really. One was a lot of advice about the garden from Kathy Connolly, who's a great Connecticut natural gardener and designer and installer of gardens. And she talked about paths as one thing. And I've just went down and had dinner at her house the other night, and she has these great wood chip paths, probably 4 feet wide, around the garden. She's got a couple of acres of garden, and her garden does not look like the shoemaker's children. Her garden's really beautiful. But if you stay on the paths, you won't, the ticks generally hang out from about knee to shin level on grasses and low growing plants around the landscape, waiting to hitch a ride on a mammal. And if you stay on the paths, in the middle of the paths, you're not exposed to that. So that's helpful. And then I also got in touch with an organization at the University of Rhode Island called Tick Encounter. And they're a great resource. They've got all sorts of information about helping you identify ticks. If you take a picture of the top side of a tick and send it to them, they'll send you back an ID within 24 hours. And also the information about, based on your zip code, what the chances are that they're infected with various diseases in your area. But both Kathy and Tick Encounter agreed that the permethrin treated clothing was really about the best defense.
So talk about that a little bit more. They were saying that DEET it's good for mosquitoes, but it's not that effective throughout the day while you're out and gardening. But to buy permethrin treated gaiters and socks or other clothes.
Shirts, and you can even send, there's a company called Insect Shield that you can send your favorite gardening outfit in, and they will treat it for you and send it back to you.
Oh. And something like they can hold up to 70 washings, but you're not supposed to mix it with other clothing. So right. You ought to have a full wardrobe of permethrin treated clothes so you can wash it in its own batch, I guess. I don't know.
I'm shopping for it because we've been having terrible problems with ticks this summer.
Yes.
I'm really tired of finding ticks crawling on me.
Yeah. This is a bad year for them. Well, so tell us how you made the transition from garden author, and are you working on any books now, to being a podcast host? How does that work?
Well, I'm still writing a lot. I've got a syndicated newspaper column that circulates through central New England. And it circulates to anywhere, depending on the week, from a couple 100,000 to 400,000 people, readers. So it gets around, and it's often based on information I've collected for the podcast. The podcast was just a way of, I thought, how do you reach a different audience with this? I'd been doing writing, and the opportunities for writing have been shrinking. And podcasts are popular, and I thought, why not try it? And it was a huge learning curve. Mastering all the software was I was 65 when I started it, and I have a young friend who refers to the software changes as boomer removers. That apparently people my age get frustrated and give up and go away. But I hung in there and learned about recording for radio. The podcast also plays on about 10 radio stations.
So now you said syndicated column. I didn't even know those existed anymore. Where can are the print columns online? Can we find them? Are they on your website?
I was going to put them, I've got to be more conscientious about putting them on my website. I've been slack about that. But I don't know if they are online.
Well, you've got to find that out. I think you've got a lot of print readers. And then tell us, for us boomers who removed ourselves, how do we listen to your podcasts?
That's pretty easy. You just go to my website, thomaschristophergardens.com, and there's an icon there for Growing Greener. Click on that, and it'll take you to my podcast page, and you can just click on the button beside the podcast, and it'll play you a selection of the most recent podcasts. And then if you want to listen to some of the older ones, you can go, there's information about subscribing. You can go to things like Apple or the different services that archive podcasts.
Okay. And yeah, I've signed up for them. And so now I get little messages on my iPhone when your next one comes out, or somewhere I do. And I can just listen to you on the iPhone, but it's really convenient and good. How do you come up with your guests for that?
Yeah, that's been, I thought that was going to be more of a challenge than it has been. I'm just really genuinely interested in the topic. So I'm always reading and going to webinars, attending webinars and talking to people. And, topics come up. I mean, talking to you and Lydia this morning, I've already identified several things that I want to pursue. And when I find out about a topic that sounds interesting or a person's easy, but just this week I was talking to a woman that I met at a Ecological Landscape Alliance meeting a couple of years ago, who's been working very hard on recycling and minimizing the use of plastic nursery pots, and talks about what a huge consumer of petrochemicals and a huge source of waste the nursery is with its black plastic pots. And she's been doing work with the Missouri Botanical Garden to both increase recycling and then find alternatives to the plastic pots.
So what are some of these emerging trends that we're seeing in sustainable gardening? Because I feel like for those of us who are shifting away from the decorative yard that pops, that we really care more about the whole environment. What's the next tipping point? What's going to change?
Boy, that's interesting. I think it's going to become much more widespread. I mean, I think there's people reaching out. There have been people like the membership of the Wild Ones who've been doing this for a long time. I think the big thing that's coming down is bringing that to the general public and involving the general public. I just did a podcast with Mary Phillips of the National Wildlife Federation, and she talked about they're selling sort of pre-planned and pre-packaged gardens to people. They've apparently since the 1970s had a program in certifying your yard as a wildlife habitat, and they've reached I think she said they had 265,000 certified wildlife habitats around the country. So they've already had a big reach, but they want to make it very easy. And what you do is you log on to their website, and then you give them your, what kind of garden you want, what are your circumstances, and then your zip code. And they will match you up with a pre-designed garden. And if you pay the fee, they'll send you the plants. And they've been very definite about growing the plants within your ecoregion.
Talk a little bit more about ecoregions. I think we're one of the organizations that feels comfortable talking ecoregion speak, but how do we make sense of that for other people?
Yeah, it's, plants are local. I mean, it's like the Wild Ones plant sale is talking about selling plants that were collected from seed locally. Plants adapt to their circumstances over time. I mean, they've had thousands and thousands of years to adapt so that they're well tuned to the local circumstances, whether that's the climate or the soil or the wildlife regime in their area. And one of the problems in growing native plants and marketing native plants is that the big wholesale nurseries regarded native plants as really fungible. So for instance, if you go out to buy a red maple, which are very common around here, you may very well get a red maple that's been grown by a wholesale nursery from stock they collected down in Florida, which is very poorly adapted to your climate. I mean, it didn't evolve with cold winters. I mean, it'll interbreed with the local trees, but it's not necessarily well adapted to your region. So I think that's going to be one of the big changes in gardening, is people starting to demand, and it could be very good for local native plant nurseries too. People demanding locally produced plants.
Yeah. Do you have any favorite sources for plants around here, or up in the Berkshires too?
Well, there's a nursery in the Berkshires called Helia, which grows grows locally sourced plants. I love the plant sales. I mean, I really do. The society plant sales are a great way to get plants, and you're supporting something good at the same time too.
And hopefully we get to have more of those in person again. It's been a frustrating year and a half where groups couldn't hold those sales so easily.
Yeah.
But we soldiered through with Wild Ones. How do you get municipalities in the state to change their practices?
That's interesting. I think Maggie Redfern is on, and she's been working. I think it's focused locally. I mean, she's been working in New London with a group to get the city of New London to plant native trees as street trees, and so increase habitat that way. And I think that's a great way. The Pollinator Pathways Group, that's an organization that's just exploding, by the way. I did a program with them, with the chapter in Fairfield, I believe in Fairfield or Weston. No, I guess it was Weston, that was the original pioneer of that in the Northeast. And they've over a couple of years, that has gone to, I think, over 100 different towns, all the way up and down the East Coast, all the way down to Maryland.
Yes, that is one of those movements that has really started. So
and they made a success of it partly because they calculated on how to design an organization that would stay genuinely local and flexible, so that people who adopted their model could change it to suit their circumstances. And I think thinking locally is really important.
So you have a split personality. You get to think locally in the Berkshires and locally in Middletown. Is there much difference between the two?
Oh, tremendous difference. I mean, we still have winters in the Berkshires. I mean, severe winters. And up in the Berkshires in Middletown, I have a collection of different plants. There's some natives. There's also some exotics. Up in the Berkshires, we're in the middle of several thousand acres of pretty much unspoiled forest. So I won't plant any, aside from vegetables, I won't plant any non-natives up there. And then the winters are much colder. The soils are thin and glacial up there. When we start a garden bed, my wife and I kid that we're mining for soil. We find a vein and follow it down between the boulders.
quick, plant something. Yes. Great. Well, this is the list of questions that we received. Does anybody else have one that you haven't typed in? Or Maggie, we're going to put you on the spot. If you've got a good audio connection, do you want to talk more about activities in New London, or anybody else on the group?
So maybe while Maggie is getting on, I do have one question from a member who couldn't join today, but she asked that I convey this question to Tom. And it started with, she says she's been observing that there seem to be fewer pollinator insects in her garden this year. So she's wondering, has Tom, have you observed this? And do you think it has any relationship to the unexplained songbird deaths that we have also been seeing, and that Audubon Society has now warned us to, put away the bird feeders for a while and clean the bird baths, and to try, in case it's a disease. They still don't know what that is about either. So
I'm afraid that's above my pay grade. That would require somebody who's been doing research into this area. I haven't noticed a decrease in pollinators, but I would check, if there's things like mosquito spraying going on in the community, which can be very destructive.
Okay.
I've turned on my video and turned on my microphone. Thanks for the invitation to join you all today. Tom, thanks so much for your answers. You touch on so many different interesting subjects. I was actually the person that asked, how do you get municipalities to change their practices? As you mentioned, as we spoke about with the New London Trees and Planting Native Trees podcast, we're trying to work with the City of New London to plant native trees, especially in our parks and larger open spaces. But it's really hard to get them to use the right practices all the time. Staff isn't necessarily trained as horticulturists. The job description for the Public Works Department actually just says, I think, high school diploma. You don't have to have any horticultural experience to actually work for the city's Public Works department, Parks Department. So, and it's hard to, we wouldn't be training that staff, but people are stressed for time. And I think there's not I learned gardening by working on it. You can't really learn gardening just from one quick instruction. It's something that takes time to learn. And I feel like our municipal staff is, constantly responding to emergencies and crisis situation, and they don't invest the thought into, working on landscapes in this way. I don't know if you or maybe anyone else in the meeting today has had those types of experiences. How do we get, legislation? How do we, on the local level, how do we get those things to change? Or maybe it needs to happen on the statewide level. DOT could be a leader in this if we could get them to think about it. But most of the things they're working on right now is tree removals along 95. So there's so many different challenges. It's not really a question, it's kind of more of a comment and something that I'm observing with the desire to create more ecologically beneficial landscapes.
I think it's great to work on a local level, because I know I'm in Middletown during the week, city of about 50,000 people, and a relatively small number of voters, if they sign a petition or join an organization, can throw the local politicians into a panic, because elections are decided by a relatively small number of people, one way or the other. And there's a great local environmental organization that actually raised money for street trees. And the head of the Urban Forestry Commission here, Jane Harris, a wonderful person who's worked a lot with American chestnut trees and the various other causes, but she's the head of the Urban Forestry Commission, and they've been very active in planting more street trees, and she's been selecting the types. You know, it is interesting though. She's run into some of the same problems that you're discussing, where she's got, you know, they regard planting street trees about like installing stop signs, and it can be done whenever they're not busy with something else, even in the middle of the summer. And unless somebody holds their feet to the fire, they'll leave the trees that have been purchased just sitting in a yard for weeks or months. And it takes personal attention, which is another reason why I think locally is the way to go.
It will be interesting to see sustainable CT as a movement, as an effort. A few years ago, it was more about light bulbs and energy efficiency and transportation audits. A couple of years ago, they added your town could get points for trying to control invasive species, which is why we started the Nix the Knotweed thing. It was like, we can help our town get the bronze medal. This past year, they added pollinator pathway participation. And now they're looking also at waste minimization and composting, wet waste recycling. So that's been kind of a new incentive program, but I'm not quite sure how they set their priorities and how you go about that at the state level. If somehow we could dial in more of this with the municipalities.
And I think a lot of these local ventures are inspiring, like the pollinator pathways. I mean, that started very local and had a big impact on its original hometown, but then it inspired imitators all over the place. So I think local efforts can be broader in their application than just their own, you know, town limits.
I was very recently contacted by our city town planner, who was responding to an email I sent her probably close to a year ago, talking about tree equity for sustainability. And this was that initiative you're talking about, Suzanne, with sustainable CT. So they're hoping to maybe change their practices so they can get some points, which, you know, if you have to just get a certain number of points to get the gold star, this is one of those things everyone should be working on the gold star for, right? So it'll be interesting to see if we really can change where trees are planted in the city based on the need for it, not necessarily just who has the money and who has the largest voice for it.
Right.
Yeah. I just received an email from Kim Stoner not long ago about an event that might be of interest to this group. There is the Connecticut Climate Crisis Mobilization, which is the name of the organization, is sponsoring a land use, climate, and equity forum on July 25th from 4 to 6 p.m. It's a Zoom forum, and let's see, I'll put the link into the chat to register for that. But I think maybe the other link is to sort of help municipalities recognize the role of plants and plantings on climate resilience in their communities, and to try to, kind of integrate that into their kind of strategic approach.
These are both frustrating and inspirational times for us. I think we're really seeing different communities of people coming together. And if we come to gardening from a climate change mitigation perspective, we're reaching different audiences. We're reaching different partners and allies. So I'm both scared and excited at the same that we need to be doing things. We need to be doing things faster. We need more allies, and we need to help other communities.
And I think we need to focus. One of the questions that you sent to me, Suzanne, that was sent in ahead of time, was about how do you basically maintain, in the face of such pressing environmental problems. And I think you need to focus on the positive. As well as, I mean, yes, there are these, because the media loves to come up with disaster stories. I mean, it gets people, if you panic people, I guess it sells newspapers. I don't know. It catches people's attention, but, less sexy, but it's really important, are focusing on the positive stories, the accomplishments, things like the spread of pollinator pathways, things like I think of how things have changed since I started gardening 50 years ago. And, nobody cared about native plants then. Nobody, except for a handful of like wildflower gardeners. I mean, things have changed so dramatically. And I think we're on the cusp of really big changes. I mean, I know that Douglas Tallamy is trying to take his plan for planting a backyard national park, homegrown national parks nationwide. And I think we're at a place where people are worried, people are concerned, and I think we could really start to make a big impact. And I think it's a very exciting time.
And thank you, Tom, to people like you who help us connect the dots and bring forward these other interesting gardeners to talk with. You ask the right questions. So that's it for the formal program. If anybody else wants to turn on a mic and have any quick comment with Tom, we had one question. Somebody had some apple advice. Where is that?
Oh, yes, I love apple trees. I'm getting ready to plant a little apple orchard up in the Berkshires, but I'm not an expert by any means. I would ask the person, I guess they said that they have 2 trees that they planted too deeply, which is a big concern to begin with. But apparently instead of growing up as dwarfs or semi-dwarfs, they're growing up as standard apple trees because they've rooted from the top growth. This sets up red flags for me right off the bat. But I would ask them, they said that they aren't producing any fruit. And I wonder if they're flowering yet. And also if they have the appropriate cross-pollinators, because most apple trees need cross-pollination. And you have to have trees that bloom at the same time and also are genetically compatible.
Yeah.
So I would get in touch with their nursery, whoever supplied them with these two old-fashioned apple trees, and ask them what are the appropriate pollinators and make sure they have that.
Right. And what in the world was the base rootstock? One assumes it was a blooming apple. Who knows? Might not be a very good bearing one. So, well, thank you again. Your next podcast comes out when, Tom?
Next Wednesday. And I'm going to be talking, this is a controversial one. I got in touch with a guy who's named Fred Pierce, who's an award-winning environmental journalist in Britain, who's written a book talking about how invasive species are going to save nature.
Oh.
That was kind of my reaction too, Suzanne.
I want to listen to this.
It's provocative. It challenges a lot of what I think. And it's making me reassess and think about things. So I doubt I'm going to come around to his position, but it may cause me to adjust some of my thinking about how about introduced plants.
Yeah. Well, I have some knotweed vodka for him. Maybe I should send him some.
I did allude to that program and said that if he thinks that invasives aren't a problem, that he should speak to you.
Well, thank you. So, Lydia, we're going to hand this back to you. Again, thank you so much, Tom. This has been recorded to be watched. It'll be posted.